You're placed in a cold metal box. The door slams shut, locking you inside. Darkness swallows the space, and suddenly there's nothing. No sound, no light, just an endless silence. Hours blur into days, and you're left with only your thoughts, trapped in a space too small to escape. The air feels heavy, the walls start to close in, and the loneliness sinks deeper. Every second stretches, twisting your mind as the isolation takes hold. You're not sure how much more you can take. This wasn't just a bad dream. It was a real experiment, and the scars it left are still felt today. In this video, we're diving into the most disturbing psychological experiments ever conducted, ones that shattered minds and crossed lines that should never have been crossed. The Landis Facial Expressions Experiment, conducted in 1924 by Carney Landis, is one of the most unsettling and ethically questionable studies in the history of psychology. Landis, a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, was fascinated by the idea of whether human emotions could be universally identified through facial expressions. His experiment, however, took a deeply disturbing turn and raised more questions about moral boundaries in psychological research than it did about the nature of human emotions. Landis wanted to see if specific emotions, such as disgust, fear, and happiness, were reflected in predictable, universal facial expressions across all people. To test this, he gathered a group of students and exposed them to a series of emotionally provocative stimuli, intending to capture their reactions on camera. The participants were drawn into what they thought was a straightforward experiment, but what they experienced left a lasting impact. To record their facial expressions, Landis painted lines on their faces to highlight muscle movements, and then subjected them to various extreme and disturbing scenarios. The participants were exposed to intense sounds, images, and smells, things that were meant to provoke strong emotional responses, but none of this prepared them for what came next. In one of the final parts of the experiment, Landis placed a live rat in front of each participant and handed them a knife. He then asked them to decapitate the rat, an order that took the study from psychological research to an act of cruelty. The students were horrified and conflicted, but most, under the pressure of the authority figure and the scientific setting, complied. With shaky hands and racing hearts, they hesitated, some managing to kill the rat, while others refused, horrified by the request. For those who couldn't bring themselves to do it, Landis performed the act himself, all while photographing their expressions of terror, disgust, and anguish. The experiment revealed very little about facial expressions, but it exposed something much darker: the capacity for compliance under authority, even in deeply unsettling and violent situations. Landis's methods were criticized for their cruelty, and the trauma inflicted on participants was undeniable. The study didn't provide any valuable scientific insights, but it became a haunting reminder of how far a researcher can go when ethical boundaries are crossed. In the 1970s, Harry Harlow, already notorious for his work on maternal deprivation, designed one of the most unsettling experiments in the history of psychology. The apparatus he created was given a name that reflected its horrific purpose: the pit of despair. Harlow wasn't just interested in the bond between mother and infant anymore. He wanted to understand what happened when an animal was subjected to complete isolation and total emotional deprivation. To carry out this experiment, Harlow constructed a small metal chamber with sloped walls, making it impossible for the animal inside to escape or even attempt to interact with its environment. Infant monkeys, who had only ever known their mothers, were taken away and placed inside this device, often for months at a time. Inside the pit of despair, these young monkeys were given no interaction, no stimulation, and no comfort. They were left utterly alone in a space designed to drive them into extreme psychological distress. The results were every bit as grim as Harlow had intended. Within days, the once active and curious baby monkeys became lethargic and withdrawn. Deprived of any form of social contact, they stopped moving around the cage, stopped exploring, and even stopped eating. Some sat motionless in a corner, their tiny bodies hunched over, while others engaged in self-harming behaviors, rocking back and forth or pulling at their fur. By the time they were finally removed from isolation, these monkeys had been emotionally destroyed. Harlow noted how deeply the damage ran. After spending prolonged periods in the pit, the monkeys were never the same. They could not reintegrate with other monkeys. Instead, they exhibited extreme antisocial behaviors. Some became violent and lashed out aggressively, while others remained completely detached, incapable of forming any relationships. Even basic interactions, like playing or grooming, were foreign to them. The mental collapse they experienced inside the pit was irreversible. The Pit of Despair experiment is a reminder of the lengths to which researchers have gone in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Harlow's work, though it revealed important insights into the consequences of social deprivation, left deep scars, both on the monkeys he experimented on and on the field of psychology itself. The cruelty of the Pit of Despair drew widespread criticism and raised significant questions about the ethics of animal research. It stands as a dark chapter in psychological studies, illustrating how easily the drive for knowledge can lead to inhumane practices that should never be repeated. In 1971, Dr. Philip Zimbardo sought to understand how power corrupts and how authority changes behavior. To do this, he created the Stanford Prison Experiment, which would become one of the most infamous psychological studies in history. The goal was to simulate a prison environment and observe how ordinary people, when placed in positions of power or submission, would react. Would guards abuse their authority? Would prisoners fight back or give in? Zimbardo recruited 24 male college students, all mentally healthy, and offered them $15 a day to participate. These volunteers were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners. The prisoners were told they would experience life behind bars, while the guards were tasked with maintaining order, without using physical force. However, the lack of clear restrictions left the guards free to interpret their roles as they saw fit. The experiment began when real police officers arrested the prisoners at their homes, then blindfolded and transported them to a mock prison set up in the basement of Stanford University. Once there, the prisoners were stripped, deloused, and given uniforms. Their names were replaced with numbers and chains were attached to their ankles. The guards, outfitted in military-style uniforms, batons, and mirrored sunglasses, quickly embraced their newfound authority. Within hours, the guards began to assert control, forcing prisoners to perform degrading tasks like scrubbing toilets and doing push-ups. Although physical violence wasn't allowed, the guards used psychological abuse, including sleep deprivation, restricting bathroom access, and subjecting the prisoners to humiliating punishments. The power dynamics quickly escalated, leading to emotional breakdowns among the prisoners. After just 36 hours, one prisoner, known as Prisoner 8612, had a severe emotional collapse. He screamed, cried, and begged to be released. Zimbardo allowed him to leave, but the abuse intensified. The guards treated the prisoners as subhuman, locking them in dark closets for hours and isolating them for long periods. What began as a simulation had become a real-life nightmare. Although the experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, it was called off after only 6 days. Dr. Christina Maslach, a colleague of Zimbardo, visited the mock prison and was horrified by the cruelty she witnessed. Her confrontation with Zimbardo finally brought the study to an end. The experiment left lasting psychological scars on both prisoners and guards, raising serious ethical concerns and forever changing the way psychological research is conducted. The Little Albert experiment, conducted in 1920 by John B. Watson, stands as a disturbing reminder of the lengths some scientists were willing to go in the pursuit of knowledge. Watson, a pioneer of behaviorism, wanted to prove that fear wasn't something we were born with. It could be conditioned. And to test this theory, he chose his subject, a helpless, orphaned baby known only as Little Albert. Albert was just 9 months old when Watson began his experiment. A small, innocent child who had already lost his parents, Albert had no choice in what was about to happen to him. Watson, seeing an opportunity to mold this child's mind, set out to create fear where there had been none before. At first, Watson introduced Albert to a white laboratory rat. The boy showed no signs of fear. He even reached out to touch the creature with curiosity. But that wasn't what Watson wanted. He wanted to see if Albert could be made terrified of something that, initially, meant nothing to him. So, he devised a cruel plan. Each time little Albert touched the rat, Watson made a sudden loud noise, striking a steel bar with a hammer right behind the baby's head. The noise was so startling that Albert would cry out in fear. Watson repeated this over and over until the mere sight of the rat, without any noise, was enough to send Albert into a fit of panic and tears. The rat had become a symbol of terror, forever burned into the child's mind. But the cruelty didn't end there. Albert's fear spread. Soon it wasn't just the rat that terrified him. Anything white and furry, a rabbit, a dog, even a fur coat or a Santa Claus mask, triggered the same fearful response. Watson had turned this child's world into a place filled with unexplained horrors. And then the most tragic part. Watson never tried to undo the fear he had created. Albert left the facility before any attempt to reverse the conditioning could be made, and the emotional damage Watson inflicted on this innocent child was never repaired. Little Albert was sent away, left to live with the fear Watson had planted in him, without anyone ever helping him understand why. What became of little Albert is still a mystery. Many believe he lived the rest of his life haunted by fears he never understood. Fears that were created in a lab by a man who saw him as nothing more than a test subject. The Little Albert Experiment remains one of the most unethical studies in the history of psychology. It's a chilling example of how innocence can be exploited in the name of science, and a haunting reminder of why ethical guidelines are so crucial to protect the vulnerable from harm. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that would forever change how we understand human behavior and authority. His question was simple, but unsettling. How far will people go in obeying orders, even when those orders involve harming someone else? Milgram's study was inspired by the horrors of World War II, particularly the atrocities committed by ordinary people who claimed they were just following orders. He wanted to know if the capacity for such blind obedience existed in everyone. What he found was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The setup of the experiment was deceptively simple. Milgram recruited ordinary people, telling them they were participating in a study on learning and memory. Each volunteer was assigned the role of a teacher, while an actor who was in on the experiment played the role of the learner. The teacher and learner were placed in separate rooms, but the teacher could hear the learner through a speaker. The teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock to the learner every time they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the teachers didn't know that. The learner, who was acting, would cry out in pain, scream, and beg for the experiment to stop as the shocks supposedly increased in intensity. As the shocks intensified, many teachers hesitated. They became uncomfortable as the learner's cries of pain grew louder. Yet, whenever they tried to stop, an authority figure, the experimenter, dressed in a white lab coat, would urge them to continue. The experiment requires that you continue. They would say, you have no choice but to go on. The shocking result? 65% of participants were willing to deliver the highest voltage shock, even though they believed they were causing extreme pain, possibly even death. They were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, and in some cases, openly questioning what they were doing. But the presence of an authority figure, calmly insisting they continue, was enough to override their conscience. The Milgram experiment revealed a terrifying truth. Ordinary people, under the right conditions, will obey authority figures to the point of causing harm to others. The study exposed the dark side of human nature and raised profound ethical questions about the limits of obedience. Milgram's findings sparked global debate and changed the way we think about authority, morality, and personal responsibility. The experiment remains one of the most famous and controversial in the history of psychology, a sobering reminder of the power of authority to corrupt human behavior. The monster study of 1939 is one of the most chilling and unethical experiments ever conducted in the field of psychology. Led by Dr. Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist, this study took a group of innocent children and turned them into unwitting test subjects in a cruel attempt to understand the causes of stuttering. But the methods used and the lasting damage inflicted on these children earned the study its haunting name. Johnson, along with his graduate student Mary Tudor, chose 22 children from an Iowa orphanage for the experiment. Some of these children had speech impediments, but most did not. These orphans were already vulnerable, having been abandoned by their families, but that didn't stop Johnson from using them to test his disturbing hypothesis. Could stuttering be induced through psychological manipulation? The children were divided into two groups. One group received positive speech therapy, praise for their fluency, and encouragement to speak confidently. But it was the second group, the one that would come to define the experiment, that was subjected to something far darker. The children in this group, some of whom had no history of speech issues, were treated as if they had severe speech problems. They were constantly criticized and told they were stutterers, even when they spoke perfectly fine. Every mistake, every pause in their speech was harshly pointed out, reinforcing the idea that they had a debilitating speech disorder. Over time, the children in the negative group began to internalize the criticism. They grew withdrawn, anxious, and hesitant to speak. Some of the children, who had no prior speech problems, began to stutter. The psychological damage was profound. Even after the experiment ended, many of the children who had been labeled stutterers never fully recovered. They carried the trauma and self-doubt instilled in them by the study for the rest of their lives. The monster study wasn't published during Johnson's lifetime, likely due to its deeply unethical nature. It wasn't until decades later that the full extent of the harm inflicted on these children became known. For these orphans, many of whom already felt abandoned, the study compounded their suffering, leaving scars far deeper than speech difficulties. These experiments may be shocking, but they've helped shape the ethical guidelines we rely on today. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to the channel for more content on psychology and the dark side of human behavior. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.